Welcome. You have made it here, to this quiet hour. As you settle in, let the day's noise fade. Let your thoughts slow, one by one. Tonight, we're going to explore how American families survived winter nights in the early 1800s. For months at a time, their world was small, cold, and enclosed. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. Daylight ended early. The wilderness pressed against thin wooden walls. In this environment, staying warm through the night was not comfort. It was survival. How did families manage this? How did they sleep without freezing? Their methods were practical, built from generations of trial. They relied on thick log walls, careful fire management, and layers of wool and feather. There was no single solution. It was a system of many elements working together. Over the next while, we will move through one winter night in a frontier cabin. We will see how families prepared as darkness fell, how they maintained warmth through the long hours, and how they woke again in the morning. So settle in. Let the story unfold at its own pace. The early 1800s in North America were colder than we remember them. The Little Ice Age had not yet ended. This climatic period, which had begun in the 1300s, would not fully release its grip until around 1850. The Northern Hemisphere experienced winters that were longer and more severe than those we know today. Springs came late, summers ended early. The seasons were compressed into a narrower window, and winter stretched across half the year. European settlers who arrived in the New World expected the climate to match the latitudes they had left behind. They assumed that regions at the same distance from the equator would have similar weather, but the continental interior of North America followed different rules. Winters were harsher, summers were hotter. The oscillation between extremes was greater than anything they had prepared for. This was not simply folklore or exaggeration. Temperature records from this period, though incomplete, show consistent patterns of cold. Rivers that rarely froze in later centuries became solid highways of ice. Harbours remained frozen well into spring. Snowfall lasted longer, accumulated deeper, and melted more slowly. The Little Ice Age was driven by several factors that overlapped across decades. Solar activity declined during a period known as the Dalton Minimum, which lasted from the 1790s into the 1830s. During this time, the sun emitted less energy, and the Earth's surface received marginally less warmth. The difference was small in absolute terms, roughly 1 degree Celsius, but over years and decades this reduction had measurable effects. Growing seasons shortened. Frosts arrived earlier in autumn and lingered later in spring. Crops that had been reliable in one generation became uncertain in the next. Volcanic eruptions added to the cooling. In 1815, Mount Tambora in Indonesia erupted with a force rarely seen in recorded history. The volcano ejected an estimated 37 cubic kilometres of material into the atmosphere. This ash and sulfur dioxide formed a thick aerosol cloud that spread across the globe, scattering sunlight before it could reach the Earth's surface. The immediate effect was a drop in global temperatures. The year that followed, 1816, became known as the year without a summer. In New England and the mid-Atlantic, frost occurred in every month. Snow fell in June. Farmers watched their crops freeze on the vine. Animals that had been put out to pasture shivered in fields covered with ice. The phrase, 1800 and froze to death, entered common speech. It was not hyperbole. It was a marker of trauma, a reference point against which all future winters would be measured. The psychological weight of that year was profound. Families who had believed they understood the limits of cold discovered they had been mistaken. Those who had assumed their preparations were adequate found themselves hungry. The failed harvests of 1816 led to food shortages that persisted into 1817. Grain reserves were depleted. Livestock was slaughtered prematurely because there was no feed to sustain them through the next winter. The experience changed the way an entire generation thought about survival. In the decades that followed, winter remained an adversary. The cold was not constant, but it was unpredictable. A mild December could be followed by a brutal January. A February thaw could give way to March blizzards. The lesson learned was clear. Preparation could not be deferred. Every autumn, families began the process of fortifying their homes, gathering firewood and layering their beds. The work was repetitive, unglamorous, and essential. Winter in the frontier cabin was not a season to be enjoyed. It was a siege to be endured. The land froze. The sky turned grey. The air became sharp and still. Inside the small one-room cabins, families gathered around fires that could not be allowed to die. The world outside was vast and indifferent. The world inside was small, warm and meticulously controlled. The cold was not an abstract concept. It was a physical presence. It seeped through gaps in the walls. It pooled on the floor. It rose from the ground beneath the floorboards. It condensed on the interior walls, forming frost that did not melt until the fire was stoked again in the morning. The air itself became an enemy, and every opening, every crack, every space where wood did not meet wood perfectly was a breach in the defence. But this was the world they lived in, and they had learned, over years and generations, how to survive it. The methods they developed were not dramatic. They were systematic. They were patient. They were based on an understanding of wood, fire, wool, and feather that we have largely forgotten. This is how they did it. The eruption of Mount Tambora in April 1815 was heard over 1,000 miles away. The explosion sent a column of ash and gas 40 kilometres into the sky. The island where the volcano stood lost more than a metre of elevation. The eruption killed tens of thousands immediately, but the global consequences were only beginning. The ash and sulfur dioxide released by the volcano did not fall back to Earth quickly. Instead, they spread across the stratosphere, forming a veil that reflected sunlight away from the planet's surface. The particles remained suspended for months, circulating in the upper atmosphere and gradually dispersing across both hemispheres. The result was a measurable cooling that lasted more than a year. By the summer of 1816, the effects were evident in North America. Temperatures dropped below normal across the northeastern United States and Canada. In June, snow fell in New York, Maine, and parts of Pennsylvania. Frost damaged crops in Massachusetts and Vermont. Farmers who had planted their fields in the expectation of a normal growing season watched as the cold killed seedlings that had just begun to emerge from the soil. The timing was catastrophic. Agriculture in the early 1800s depended on a narrow window of warm weather. Planting occurred in late spring. Crops matured through the summer. Harvest took place in late summer and early autumn. If the growing season was shortened by even a few weeks, yields fell. If frost arrived early, entire fields could be lost. In 1816, the growing season was not shortened by weeks. It was nearly erased. Corn, which required consistent warmth, failed across wide regions. Wheat and barley were damaged by repeated frosts. Potatoes, more resilient than grain, survived in some areas, but could not make up for the losses in staple crops. By autumn, it was clear that the harvest would be insufficient to feed the population through the winter. The winter that followed, often referred to as the hungry winter, was marked by scarcity. Grain prices rose sharply. Families that had relied on buying flour found it either unavailable or prohibitively expensive. Those who had stored their own grain from previous years were fortunate. Those who had not faced difficult choices, livestock were slaughtered earlier than planned because there was not enough feed to sustain them. Families reduced their own caloric intake, stretching meals across more days. The memory of 1816 lingered. It became a reference point, a warning. When families spoke of winter preparation in the years that followed, they invoked the year without a summer as the standard. They asked themselves, if another year like that came, would they be ready? This fear shaped behaviour. Families began to stockpile more wood than they thought they would need. They expanded their root cellars to hold additional stores of potatoes, carrots, and preserved meat. They invested in heavier blankets and additional mattress ticks. The cold of 1816 had taught them that assumptions about climate were fragile. The seasons could not be trusted. The psychological impact extended beyond practical preparation. The year became a story, told and retold. Children who had been too young to remember it clearly grew up hearing about the summer that never came. They heard about neighbours who had been caught unprepared, about families who had run out of firewood in February, about livestock that had frozen because barns were inadequately insulated. These stories functioned as warnings. They reinforced the lesson that survival required vigilance. The broader pattern of the Little Ice Age provided the context. The cooling that had begun centuries earlier was not a steady decline, but a series of fluctuations. Some decades were colder than others. Some winters were brutal, others were mild. But the overall trend was toward lower temperatures, and this trend made agriculture precarious in regions where it had previously been stable. For frontier families in the 1800s, this meant that every winter was a test. The severity varied, but the fundamental challenge remained the same. The cabin had to be made tight. The firewood had to be sufficient, the bedding had to be adequate, the routines had to be followed, there was no room for complacency. The cold was not just an inconvenience, it was a force that could kill. Children, the elderly, and the ill were particularly vulnerable. Frostbite could claim fingers and toes. Hypothermia could set in during sleep if the fire went out, and the temperature inside the cabin dropped too far. The line between safety and danger was narrow, and it was maintained through constant effort. So the families prepared. They prepared in summer when the work of gathering wood began. They prepared in autumn when the chinking in the walls was inspected and repaired. They prepared in early winter when the first snows arrived and the routines of fire management and bed warming became daily rituals. And they prepared each evening as the sun set and the temperature dropped, knowing that the night ahead would be long and cold. This was the world shaped by the Little Ice Age. This was the environment in which Americans slept. Before a cabin could be built, the forest had to be studied. Not every tree was suitable. The wood had to meet specific requirements. It had to be straight enough to stack without excessive gaps. It had to be strong enough to support the weight of the roof. It had to resist rot and insect damage. And it had to possess the thermal properties necessary to make the cabin habitable through winter. In the southern Appalachian regions, tulip poplar was common. The trees grew tall and straight, with trunks that could be easily worked. The wood was soft compared to oak or hickory, which made it easier to cut and shape with the tools available. For a family building their first cabin, speed mattered. Tulip poplar allowed them to complete the structure quickly. In the Midwest and the Northeast, oak was preferred. White oak and red oak both provided dense, strong wood that would last for decades. Oak was harder to work than poplar, but it offered better resistance to weathering. The logs aged well, and a cabin built from oak could stand for generations. Ash was another choice. It was lighter than oak, but still strong. Ash logs could be split cleanly, which made them useful for shingles and other secondary purposes. But ash was also valued for the quality of its burn. Firewood cut from ash provided steady, reliable heat. Families who had access to ash often reserved it for fuel rather than construction. Locust was prized for its rot resistance. The wood contained natural compounds that deterred insects and slowed decay. A locust post driven into the ground could last for decades without rotting. But locust was difficult to work. The wood was knotty and hard. Cutting and shaping it required more effort than most families could spare. Locust was used selectively, often for corner posts or sills where durability was most important. The choice of wood was not purely practical, it reflected what the land offered. A family settling in a valley with abundant oak would build with oak. A family in a region dominated by pine and spruce would use those trees instead. The forest dictated the architecture, and the architecture shaped the daily life that followed. Once the species was chosen, the trees were felled. This work began in late autumn or winter, when the sap in the trees was at its lowest. Wood cut in winter was less likely to warp as it dried. The logs were trimmed of branches and stripped of bark. Bark was the first layer of vulnerability. It held moisture, which encouraged rot. It provided shelter for insects. Removing it was the first step in creating a durable home. The bark was stripped using a tool called a barking spud. This was a flat blade, often forged from an old file or piece of scrap iron, attached to a wooden handle. The worker would slide the blade between the bark and the wood, peeling away sections in long strips. The work was tedious, but necessary. A log with bark still attached would begin to decay within a year. Once the bark was removed, the logs were left to season. Seasoning allowed the wood to dry, reducing its moisture content and making it more stable. Unseasoned wood would shrink and twist as it dried, creating gaps in the cabin walls. Seasoned wood moved less, but seasoning took time, months or even a year. Families building their first cabin often could not wait. They used green wood, knowing that the cabin would settle and shift as the logs dried. This meant that the chinking between the logs would need to be repaired regularly. The logs were cut to length. A typical cabin measured between 12 and 18 feet on each side. The logs were trimmed to match these dimensions. The ends were notched to allow them to interlock at the corners. The notch design varied by region and builder, but the principle was the same. The weight of the logs above held the structure together. No nails were required. The cabin was a stacked puzzle, held in place by gravity and friction. The thickness of the logs mattered. Thicker logs provided more thermal mass. Thermal mass is the capacity of a material to absorb and store heat. Wood, though not as dense as stone, still possesses this property. During the day, sunlight striking the exterior of the cabin would warm the logs. The heat would gradually penetrate the wood, moving from the outer surface toward the interior. At night, as the air temperature dropped, the logs would release this stored heat back into the cabin. This process was slow. The thicker the log, the longer it took for heat to pass through it. A log 12 inches thick acted as a thermal buffer, smoothing out the temperature swings between day and night. The cabin would not heat up as quickly during the day, but it would also not cool as quickly at night. The result was a more stable interior environment. The thermal properties of wood were not understood in modern scientific terms. Families did not speak of thermal mass or heat capacity, but they knew, through experience, that a cabin built with thick logs stayed warmer longer. They knew that certain woods burned hotter and longer. They knew that a heavy log at the back of the fireplace would radiate heat for hours. This knowledge was accumulated over generations. It was passed from father to son, from mother to daughter. It was embedded in the choices made when the first tree was felled. The selection of wood was the first decision in a long chain of decisions that would determine whether a family would survive the winter. The forest provided the materials, the family provided the labour, and the cabin, once built, became the boundary between survival and death. The logs, once stacked, became more than walls. They became a reservoir for heat. Wood is not as dense as stone, but it shares a similar property. It absorbs warmth slowly and releases it just as slowly. This lag between absorption and release is what made the log cabin a viable shelter in sub-zero temperatures. During the day, even in winter, the sun provided some warmth. Sunlight striking the exterior surface of the logs would heat the outer layer of wood. The heat would begin to move inward, penetrating the log molecule by molecule. This process was gradual. A 12-inch thick log might take several hours for heat to move from the outer surface to the interior face. By evening, when the sun set and the air temperature dropped sharply, the heat stored in the logs would begin to reverse its flow. The warmth that had been absorbed during the day would radiate back into the cabin's interior. This release was not immediate. It continued through the night, providing a baseline warmth that supplemented the heat from the fire. This effect was most pronounced in cabins where the logs were hewn rather than left round. Hewn logs had flat surfaces that fit together more tightly. The increased surface area in contact between logs meant better thermal continuity. Heat could move more easily from one log to the next, creating a more uniform distribution of warmth across the wall. Round logs, by contrast, touched each other at only a narrow line along their length. The gaps between them were wider, and the thermal connection was weaker, but round logs were faster to prepare. For families building their first cabin, speed often took precedence over efficiency. The cabin could be improved over time. Survival required shelter now. The orientation of the cabin also mattered. A cabin with its longest wall facing south would receive more direct sunlight. The southern wall would absorb more heat during the day, and this heat would be available at night. Families did not always have the luxury of choosing their cabin's orientation. The site was often dictated by the location of water, the slope of the land, or the availability of flat ground. But when choice was possible, a southern exposure was preferred. The logs themselves varied in their thermal properties depending on the species of wood. Oak, being dense, had high thermal mass. It absorbed a significant amount of heat and held it for a long time. Pine, being less dense, absorbed less heat, but also released it more quickly. Hickory, the densest of the common building woods, provided the greatest thermal storage but was also the most difficult to work. These differences were subtle. A family living in an oak cabin might not notice a significant difference from a family living in a pine cabin, provided both cabins were well chinked and well maintained. But over the course of a long winter, the accumulated effect of these small differences could be meaningful. A cabin that stayed a few degrees warmer at night required less firewood. Less firewood meant less labour spent cutting and hauling wood. Less labour meant more time for other tasks. The thermal battery effect of the logs was most effective when combined with good fire management. A fire that burned too hot during the day would send most of its heat up the chimney, wasting fuel. A fire that was banked properly at night would smoulder slowly, providing a steady low-level heat that the logs could amplify. The goal was not to make the cabin hot, but to keep it from becoming dangerously cold. The logs also acted as a barrier against wind. Wind increases heat loss by stripping away the warm air that clings to a surface. A solid log wall, even with gaps, provided significant protection against wind. The thickness of the wood meant that cold air could not easily penetrate. The air that did enter through gaps could be managed with chinking. But the logs alone were not enough. They provided the first layer of defence, the structural foundation. The gaps between them were the weak points, and sealing those gaps required a different set of materials and techniques. This is where the work of chinking began. No two logs were identical. Each tree had grown in its own way, bending slightly toward the sun, twisting around obstacles, developing irregularities in its grain. When these logs were stacked to form a wall, they did not meet perfectly. Gaps appeared between them, some narrow, some wide, all of them pathways for cold air to enter. The gaps were not uniform. At one point along the wall, two logs might nestle closely together, leaving only a hairline crack. A few feet away, a bow in one of the logs might create a gap several inches wide. These openings were not merely inconvenient, they were dangerous. Cold air moving through even a small gap could lower the temperature of the entire cabin. Wind made the problem worse. On a still night, the air inside the cabin might remain relatively stable, even if the fire had been banked low. But when wind blew against the exterior walls, it created pressure differentials. Cold air was forced into the cabin through the gaps on the windward side. Warm air was pulled out through gaps on the opposite side. The cabin became a passage for freezing air, and the fire struggled to keep up with the heat loss. This is why sealing the gaps was as important as building the walls in the first place. A cabin with thick logs but poor chinking was colder than a cabin with thinner logs that had been properly sealed. The integrity of the seal determined whether the family would sleep in relative comfort or wake, shivering in the middle of the night. The process of sealing these gaps was called chinking and daubing. The terms were often used interchangeably, but they referred to distinct steps in the process. Chinking was the insertion of solid material into the larger gaps. Daubing was the application of a mortar-like sealant over the chinking to create a smooth, airtight surface. The work began with an inspection. In late autumn, before the first hard freeze, the family would walk around the interior of the cabin, examining each seam between the logs. They looked for places where light shone through, where a draft could be felt, where the previous year's chinking had dried out or fallen away. These were the places that needed attention. The first step was to fill the larger gaps with rigid material. Stones were common. Small, flat stones could be wedged tightly into a gap, creating a solid barrier. Wood chunks were also used, scraps left over from splitting firewood, pieces of bark that had been stripped from the logs. In some cases, families used split shingles, thin wedges of wood that could be driven into a gap and held in place by friction. This rigid filler provided the foundation for the next layer. It created a surface that the softer materials could adhere to. Without it, the soft chinking would simply fall through the gap and accumulate on the ground outside the cabin. The next layer was soft filler. This was where a variety of materials came into use, depending on what was available. Moss was a common choice. Sphagnum moss, which grew in damp areas, was particularly valued. It had natural antibacterial properties, which helped prevent rot. It was also excellent at trapping air, which made it a good insulator. Moss could be gathered in large quantities, dried slightly to make it easier to pack, and then stuffed into the gaps between the logs. Clay was another option. Wet clay could be rolled into ropes and pressed into the crevices. As it dried, it hardened, creating a firm seal. But clay had a weakness. It was brittle. As the logs shifted with changes in temperature and humidity, the clay would crack. The cracks would allow air to pass through and the seal would be lost. Clay worked best when combined with other materials that gave it flexibility. Straw was often mixed with clay to provide this flexibility. The straw fibres acted as reinforcement, holding the clay together even as it dried and shrank. Straw and clay together created a material that was both firm and somewhat elastic. It could accommodate minor movements in the logs without crumbling completely. In some regions, families used old rags and scraps of cloth. These were stuffed into the gaps layer upon layer until the space was filled. Cloth had the advantage of being flexible and easy to work with. It could be pushed into irregular spaces that would be difficult to fill with stone or clay, but cloth also absorbed moisture. If it got wet, it would lose its insulating properties and could even promote rot in the surrounding wood. Newspaper, when it was available, was another option. Shredded newspaper could be mixed with clay or used on its own. It provided bulk and helped fill the gaps, but newspaper was not durable. It deteriorated quickly, especially in damp conditions. Families who used newspaper knew they would need to replace it every year or two. Animal hair was sometimes mixed into the soft chinking. Cattle hair, sheep's wool, and even horsehair were used. The hair provided texture and helped bind the other materials together. It also added a small amount of insulation, but hair attracted pests. Mice and insects would burrow into chinking that contained animal hair, creating new gaps as they made nests. This was a trade-off. The hair improved the chinking's performance, but it also required more vigilance to prevent infestations. Once the soft chinking was in place, the final step was daubing. This was the application of a mortar-like coating over the chinking. The daub served two purposes. It sealed the chinking, preventing air from passing through any remaining small gaps, and it protected the chinking from weathering. Rain, snow, and ice could erode the soft materials. The daub acted as a shield. The daub was typically made from a mixture of mud, clay, and lime. Lime, when available, was particularly valuable. It hardened as it dried, creating a surface that was more durable than plain mud. But lime was not always accessible on the frontier. Families often had to make do with what they could find locally. The consistency of the daub was important. It had to be thick enough to stay in place when applied to a vertical surface, but not so thick that it was difficult to work. The ideal daub could be spread with the hands, smoothed into a thin layer that filled every remaining gap. Once applied, it would dry over the course of several days. As it dried, it would shrink slightly, and sometimes cracks would appear. These cracks would need to be filled with a second application. The daub was not permanent. It required maintenance. Every year the family would inspect the daubing and repair any areas that had cracked or fallen away. This was part of the annual rhythm of cabin life. In the same way that fields were ploughed and seeds were planted in spring, the chinking and daubing were repaired in autumn. The result, when done well, was a wall that was nearly airtight. The logs provided the structure and the thermal mass. The chinking filled the gaps and trapped the air. The daub sealed everything together. The cabin became a tight envelope, boundary between the cold outside and the warmth inside. But even the best chinking could not eliminate all drafts. The floor, unless it was packed earth covered with planks, remained a source of cold. Air would rise through the gaps between the floorboards, pulling heat away from the lower part of the cabin. Families learned to place their beds away from the walls and slightly elevated to avoid the coldest air that pooled near the floor. And still, the cabin was not warm by modern standards. It was simply less cold. The goal was not comfort. The goal was survival. The chinking and daubing made that survival possible. The process of sealing a cabin was not a single task, but a sequence of decisions, each building on the last. The first layer, the rigid filler, required judgment. A stone that was too large would not fit into the gap. A stone that was too small would fall through. The person doing the work had to assess each gap individually, select the right piece of material and wedge it into place firmly enough that it would not shift when the logs settled. This work was often done by the entire family. Children could gather stones from the creek bed or the fields. They could sort them by size, creating piles that the adults could draw from as they worked their way around the cabin. Older children could help with the placement, learning to judge the fit by feel. The work was slow, methodical, and repetitive. A single cabin might have hundreds of gaps that needed to be filled. The placement of the rigid filler was critical. If the stones or wood chunks were not packed tightly, they would rattle when the wind blew. More importantly, they would allow the soft filler to compress or fall out over time. The rigid layer had to be solid enough to support everything that came after it. Once the rigid filler was in place, the soft chinking began. This was where the real skill became apparent. The material had to be packed firmly, but not so tightly that it crushed itself. Moss, for example, worked best when it retained some of its natural loft. If it was compressed too much, it lost its ability to trap air. Air was the actual insulator. The moss was simply the structure that held the air in place. Clay and straw mixtures required a different technique. The clay had to be wet enough to be mouldable, but not so wet that it would slump and fall out before it dried. The straw had to be distributed evenly through the clay. If too much straw was added, the mixture would lack cohesion. If too little was added, the clay would crack as it dried. The person applying the soft chinking would take a handful of the mixture and press it into the gap, working it with their fingers to ensure it filled all the irregular spaces. They would add more material layer by layer until the gap was completely filled. Then they would move to the next gap and repeat the process. This work was done from both the inside and the outside of the cabin. A gap that appeared small from one side might be wider on the other. By working from both directions, the family could ensure that the chinking was continuous and complete. This meant that the work took twice as long, but the result was a tighter seal. The timing of this work mattered. If the chinking was done too early in the autumn, before the logs had finished settling from the previous winter's freeze-thaw cycles, the gaps might change size. The chinking would be wasted. If the work was done too late, the ground might freeze before the daubing could be applied. The ideal time was mid to late autumn, after the first light frosts but before the deep cold set in. The daubing, the third layer, was the most visible part of the process. It was what a visitor to the cabin would see from the outside. A cabin with fresh, smooth daubing looked cared for. A cabin with cracked, missing daubing looked neglected. But the appearance was secondary. The function was what mattered. The daub was mixed in batches. A typical batch might consist of several shovels of clay-rich soil, a bucket of water, and a handful of straw or grass for binding. If lime was available, it was added to the mixture. Lime improved the daub's durability and helped it resist erosion from rain. But lime was a luxury. Many families went years without access to it. The mixture was stirred until it reached the right consistency. Too thin, and it would run off the wall. Too thick, and it would be difficult to spread evenly. The right consistency was similar to thick porridge. It could be scooped up and held in the hand without dripping excessively. The application was done by hand. The person doing the work would take a handful of daub and press it against the wall, spreading it over the chinking in a thin, even layer. They would work methodically, covering a section of wall and then moving to the next. The goal was to create a continuous surface with no gaps or thin spots. As the daub dried, it would change colour, lightening from dark brown to a pale tan or grey. The drying process took several days. During this time, the family would watch for cracks. If a crack appeared, it would be filled immediately with a small amount of fresh daub. Allowing cracks to persist defeated the purpose of the daubing. In some regions, families added additional materials to the daub to improve its performance. Animal hair was common. Cattle hair, collected when the animals were brushed or slaughtered, could be mixed into the daub. The hair fibres provided tensile strength, helping to hold the daub together as it dried. Horsehair was even better, being longer and stronger, but it was less available. Dried grass, chopped into short lengths, served a similar purpose. It was easier to obtain than animal hair and worked nearly as well. Some families experimented with other fibres. Flax, if there was a surplus, could be used. Even finely shredded bark had been tried, though it was less effective. The exterior daubing was exposed to the weather. Rain would gradually erode it. Freeze-thaw cycles would cause it to crack. Snow, melting and refreezing against the wall, would work its way into any weakness. This meant that the daubing required annual maintenance. Each autumn, the family would inspect the exterior walls and repair any damage. The interior daubing faced different challenges. It It was protected from rain and snow, but it was exposed to the moisture generated inside the cabin. Cooking, breathing, and the evaporation of water from the wash basin all added humidity to the air. This moisture would be absorbed by the daubing, causing it to soften. Over time, the daub could crumble, especially in areas near the fireplace where temperature fluctuations were greatest. Some families chose to whitewash the interior daubing. Whitewash, made from lime and water, provided a protective coating. It also brightened the interior, reflecting the limited light available from the fire and the small windows. But whitewash required lime, and lime required access to limestone, a kiln, and the knowledge of how to process it. For many frontier families, these were resources they did not have. The three-layer system, rigid filler, soft chinking, and daubing, was not a frontier invention. Similar techniques had been used in Europe for centuries, but the specific materials and methods were adapted to the American environment. The types of clay, the species of trees, and the patterns of weather were all different. Families learned through trial and error which combinations worked best in their specific location. A cabin on a windswept hilltop required more robust chinking than a cabin nestled in a sheltered valley. A cabin in a region with heavy rainfall needed daubing that could withstand constant moisture. A cabin in an area with severe freeze-thaw cycles needed materials that could flex without cracking. There was no single formula. Each family developed their own approach based on what worked. The result was a wall that could breathe but not leak. The chinking and daubing were never completely airtight. Some air exchange was necessary to prevent the buildup of smoke and moisture inside the cabin. But the exchange was controlled, minimized, managed. The goal was to create a barrier that allowed the family to maintain a survivable temperature inside, even when the temperature outside dropped far below freezing. This barrier was the cabin's second line of defense. The logs provided the structure and the thermal mass. The chinking and daubing provided the seal. Together they created an envelope that could hold warmth. But warmth had to be generated first, and that required fire. The fireplace was not simply a feature of the cabin. It was the reason the cabin could function as a dwelling. Without the fireplace, the cabin was just a wooden box. The logs and the chinking could slow the loss of heat, but they could not generate it. Only the fire could do that, and the fire required a structure that could contain it safely while directing its heat into the living space. The placement of the fireplace was the first consideration. In the coldest regions, the chimney was built entirely within the interior of the cabin. This meant that the masonry, whether stone, brick, or clay, was surrounded by living space on all sides. As the fire burned, the chimney would absorb heat. The stones or bricks would warm, and this warmth would radiate into the cabin from multiple directions. A chimney built on an exterior wall was simpler to construct. It required less masonry, and the support structure could be partially integrated with the cabin's wall. But much of the heat absorbed by the chimney would be lost to the outside air. The warmth would flow outward, into the cold rather than inward, into the living space. For a family trying to survive a brutal winter, this heat loss was significant. The decision of where to place the chimney was often dictated by the cabin's design. This one-room cabin, 12 by 16 feet, had limited options. The fireplace was typically placed on one of the shorter walls, allowing the length of the cabin to serve as the main living and sleeping area. If the cabin was expanded later, a second fireplace might be added, but this required substantial additional labour and materials. The construction of the fireplace itself varied widely. In regions where stone was abundant, fireplaces were built entirely of stone. Flat stones were stacked and mortared together to create the firebox, the throat, and the chimney. Stone fireplaces were durable. They could last for decades with minimal maintenance. They also had excellent thermal mass. A large stone fireplace could absorb heat throughout the day and continue radiating it into the cabin for hours after the fire had been reduced to coals. But stone was not always available. In areas where the soil was sandy or the bedrock was deep, families had to improvise. This led to the development of the cat and clay chimney, also known as a stick and mud chimney. The cat and clay chimney was a compromise between necessity and risk. It could be built quickly with materials that were readily at hand, but it was also dangerous. The structure was inherently flawed, and families who used it knew they were accepting a certain level of hazard. The construction began with a wooden framework. Sticks or poles, usually oak, were driven into the ground to form the outer shape of the chimney. These poles were then connected with horizontal crosspieces, creating a lattice. The lattice served as the skeleton on which the chimney would be built. The next step was to create the cats. These were oblong rolls of clay, mixed with straw, grass or animal hair to give them cohesion. The cats were pressed onto the wooden framework, layer by layer, building up the walls of the chimney. The clay was worked with the hands, smoothed and shaped to create a continuous surface. The interior of the chimney, the flue, was lined with additional clay. This lining had to be as thick and smooth as possible. It was the barrier between the fire and the wooden framework. If the lining cracked or eroded, the heat from the fire could reach the wood, and the chimney would catch fire. This was not a theoretical risk. Cat and clay chimneys caught fire regularly. Families who used them kept a long pole, called a pry pole, near the hearth. If the chimney ignited, the pole could be used to push the chimney away from the cabin. The chimney would fall, still burning, into the yard. The cabin itself would be saved, though the family would be without a fireplace until a new chimney could be built. The cat and clay chimney required constant maintenance. The clay lining would crack under the repeated heating and cooling cycles. Rain would erode the exterior. The wooden framework, despite being protected by the clay, would slowly char and weaken. A cat and clay chimney might last a year or two before it needed major repairs. Some families rebuilt their chimneys every season. Despite these drawbacks, the cat and clay chimney remained common on the frontier. It was fast to build, and it required no specialised skills or tools. A family could construct one in a few days. For settlers who had just arrived in a new area and needed shelter immediately, this speed was essential. The risks could be managed. The fire could be watched. The chimney could be rebuilt if necessary. Over time, families would often replace their cat and clay chimneys with stone or brick structures. But this required access to stone or the ability to make bricks, both of which took time and resources. Until those resources were available, the cat and clay chimney served its purpose. The firebox, regardless of the chimney's construction, was the part of the fireplace where the actual burning took place. It was a rectangular chamber, open on one side to the room. The floor of the firebox was the hearth, often built up with stone or brick to protect the cabin's floor from heat and stray embers. The back wall of the firebox was critical. It had to withstand the highest temperatures and reflect heat into the room. A well-designed back wall was slightly angled, tilting forward at the top. This angle directed heat downward and outward into the living space, rather than allowing it to rise straight up the chimney. The size of the firebox mattered. A firebox that was too small would not accommodate large logs. A firebox that was too large would lose too much heat up the chimney. The ideal size was determined by the size of the cabin and the severity of the winter. A one-room cabin might have a firebox that was 3 feet wide and 2 feet deep. A larger cabin, or one in a particularly cold region, might have a firebox that was 4 or 5 feet wide. The throat of the fireplace, the narrow opening where the firebox transitioned into the chimney, controlled the draft. Draft was the flow of air that fed the fire and carried the smoke up the chimney. Too much draft and the fire would burn too hot, consuming wood quickly and sending most of the heat up the chimney. Too little draft and the fire would smoulder inefficiently, filling the cabin with smoke. Adjusting the draft was part of fire management. Families learned to control it by adjusting the size of the fire, the placement of the logs, and the amount of ash covering the coals. This required constant attention. A fire left unattended could shift from a steady burn to a roaring blaze or a smoky smoulder in a matter of minutes. The chimney itself extended above the roofline. It had to be tall enough to create sufficient draft, but not so tall that it became structurally unstable. The top of the chimney was often capped with a flat stone to prevent rain and snow from falling directly into the flue. Some families built a small hood or cover that allowed smoke to escape while keeping precipitation out. The entire system, firebox, throat, chimney, was designed to balance heat retention with smoke removal. The fire generated warmth, but it also produced smoke and gases that had to be expelled. The challenge was to keep as much heat as possible while allowing the smoke to escape. This balance was never perfect, but with careful design and maintenance it could be managed. The fireplace then was not a passive object. It was a piece of infrastructure that required knowledge to build and skill to operate. It was the metabolic heart of the cabin and everything else. The sleeping arrangements, the daily routines, the survival strategies, radiated outward from it. The cat and clay chimney represented a choice between speed and safety. For a family newly arrived on the frontier, the priority was shelter. Winter was approaching. The cabin had to be habitable before the first deep freeze. There was no time to quarry stone or to locate and haul heavy loads of material from distant sites. What was needed was a chimney that could be built in days rather than weeks, using materials that were immediately at hand. The wooden framework was simple to construct. Oak poles were preferred because oak resisted rot better than softer woods. The poles were sharpened at one end and driven into the ground in a rectangular pattern, marking the footprint of the chimney. Horizontal poles were lashed to these uprights, creating a ladder-like structure. The framework did not need to be elaborate. It simply needed to be sturdy enough to support the weight of the clay. The clay was gathered from the surrounding land. Not all clay was suitable. The best clay was dense and plastic, able to hold its shape when moulded. It was usually found near streams or in low-lying areas where water had deposited fine sediments over time. The clay was dug out, cleaned of rocks and debris, and brought back to the cabin site. Mixing the clay was labour-intensive. Water was added gradually and the mixture was kneaded with the hands or trampled, with bare feet. The goal was to achieve a consistency that was neither too wet nor too dry. If the clay was too wet, it would slump off the framework. If it was too dry, it would crack as it dried. Straw was added to the clay as it was mixed. The straw served as a binder, much like the straw used in chinking. It gave the clay tensile strength, allowing it to stretch slightly without breaking. This was important because the clay would shrink as it dried, and without the straw it would crack apart. The clay-straw mixture was formed into thick rolls, the cats. Each cat was roughly the size of a loaf of bread, though the exact dimensions varied depending on the builder's preference. The cats were pressed onto the wooden framework starting at the base and working upward. Each cat was overlapped with the one below it, creating a continuous surface. As the cats were applied, they were smoothed and shaped. The goal was to create walls that were uniform in thickness with no thin spots that might crack or allow heat to reach the wooden framework. The interior of the chimney, the flue, required special attention. This surface had to be as smooth as possible to allow smoke to rise freely without obstruction. The work progressed in stages. The chimney could not be built to its full height in a single day. The clay needed time to dry and harden. If too much weight was added too quickly, the lower sections would collapse under the load. So the chimney was built in increments, perhaps 2 or 3 feet per day, allowing each section to dry before the next was added. Once the chimney reached its full height, it was left to cure. This took several days. During this time, the clay would dry and harden, though it would never achieve the hardness of fired brick. The chimney would remain somewhat fragile, susceptible to cracking and erosion. The first fire in a cat and clay chimney was a test. The builder would start with a small fire, just enough to generate some heat and smoke. The fire would be observed closely. If cracks appeared in the clay lining, they would be noted and repaired. The fire would be gradually increased over the course of several days, allowing the clay to harden further under the heat. Even after this initial curing, the chimney required vigilance. Every time the fire was lit, there was a risk. The clay lining, subjected to high temperatures, would eventually crack. When cracks appeared, the wooden framework beneath would be exposed. If a crack went unnoticed, the framework could char and eventually ignite. Chimney fires in cat and clay chimneys were common enough that they were treated as an expected hazard. Families developed procedures for dealing with them. The pry pole kept near the hearth was the primary tool. It was a long, sturdy pole, often 10 or 12 feet in length. One end was flattened or shaped to fit against the base of the chimney. If the chimney caught fire, the family would act quickly. Everyone would be evacuated from the cabin. The person wielding the pry pole would position it against the base of the chimney and push. The goal was to tip the chimney away from the cabin, causing it to fall into the yard. This required strength and timing. If the pole slipped, or if the chimney was pushed in the wrong direction, it could fall onto the cabin itself. When the chimney fell, it would land, still burning, outside the cabin. The The family would watch as the fire consumed the remaining clay and wood. Once the fire had burned out, the debris would be cleared away. The family would be without a fireplace until a new chimney could be built. This cycle of building, using and rebuilding was a recurring pattern for families with cat and clay chimneys. It was inefficient, but it was manageable. The materials were free, the labour was their own, and the chimney, for all its flaws, allowed them to have a fire, which was the difference between survival and freezing. Some families modified the basic, designed to improve safety. They lined the interior of the flue with flat stones, if stones were available. The stones provided a heat-resistant barrier between the fire and the clay. This reduced the risk of the clay cracking and the wooden framework igniting. But stones added weight, and the wooden framework had to be reinforced to support the additional load. Another modification was to coat the interior of the flue with multiple layers of clay, allowing each layer to dry before applying the next. This created a thicker, more durable lining. But even with these improvements, the cat and clay chimney remained a temporary solution. It was understood that, eventually, it would need to be replaced with something more permanent. Families who prospered, who had the time and resources, would eventually build a stone or brick chimney. The process was slow. Stones had to be gathered or quarried. Mortar had to be mixed. The work required more skill than the cat and clay chimney, but the result was a structure that could last a lifetime. Until that time came, the cat and clay chimney served. It was flawed, dangerous and short-lived. But it was also fast, cheap and functional. For a family trying to survive their first winter on the frontier, those qualities were enough. The pry pole remained near the hearth, a reminder of the compromise that had been made. As the sun set and the temperature began to drop, the fire required a transformation. During the day, the fire had burned openly, providing heat for cooking and warmth for the cabin. The flames had been visible, the heat intense. But this type of fire was not suitable for the night. It burned too quickly, it consumed too much wood, and it sent most of its heat up the chimney rather than into the room. For the night, the fire had to be banked. Banking was the process of slowing the fire down, reducing it to a state where it would burn for hours without consuming excessive fuel. A properly banked fire would smoulder through the night, maintaining a baseline of heat that the cabin's thermal mass could amplify. The process began in the evening, typically an hour or two before the family went to bed. The first step was to allow the existing fire to burn down. If the fire was large, with multiple logs burning, it would be left alone until the logs had mostly burned through, leaving a bed of glowing coals. These coals were the foundation of the banked fire. Once the fire had reduced to coals, the family would prepare the backlog. The backlog was a large log, often 10 inches in diameter or more. It was placed at the rear of the fireplace against the back wall. The backlog served multiple purposes. It protected the back wall of the fireplace from the direct heat of the fire, preventing damage to the masonry or clay. And it provided a long-burning source of heat that would last through the night. Hickory was the preferred wood for the backlog. Hickory was dense, with a high energy content. A hickory log would burn slowly on its front face while the rear remained largely intact. The log could provide heat for 8 hours or more, depending on its size and the intensity of the coals in front of it. If hickory was not available, oak was the next choice. White oak and red oak both burned well, though not as intensely or as long as hickory. Other hardwoods, maple, ash, beech, could be used, but they burned faster and provided less heat per unit of wood. The backlog was positioned carefully. It had to be stable, resting firmly against the back wall. If it rolled forward during the night, it could scatter the coals and disrupt the banking. Smaller pieces of wood, or stones, were sometimes placed on either side of the backlog to keep it in position. With the backlog in place, the next step was to arrange the coals. The coals were raked forward, away from the backlog, and formed into a mound in the centre of the firebox. This mound was the active part of the fire. It was where the combustion would continue slowly throughout the night. The coals glowed red, radiating heat. But if left exposed to the air, they would burn too quickly. To slow them down, they had to be covered. This was done with ash. Ash was the residue of previous fires. It accumulated in the firebox, a fine grey powder mixed with small fragments of unburned wood. Throughout the day, the ash was pushed to the sides of the firebox out of the way. In the evening, it was raked back into the centre. The ash was spread over the mound of coals, covering them completely. The layer of ash had to be thick enough to restrict the flow of oxygen to the coals. Oxygen was what allowed the coals to burn. By limiting the oxygen, the burning slowed. The coals would continue to smoulder, releasing heat, but they would not consume themselves quickly. The thickness of the ash layer was critical. Too little ash, and the coals would burn through in a few hours. Too much ash, and the fire would be smothered entirely, going out before morning. The right thickness was learned through experience. It varied depending on the type of wood, the size of the coals, and the severity of the night's cold. A family that had lived in the same cabin for years would know, almost instinctively, how much ash to use. A family new to the frontier would have to learn through trial and error. There would be nights when the fire went out, and the cabin grew dangerously cold. There would be mornings when the family woke to find only cold ash in the fireplace, and someone would have to go to a neighbour to borrow coals. Once the coals were covered, the fire was considered banked. The firebox was left alone. No more wood was added. The family would go about their evening routines, preparing the beds, warming the stones that would be placed in the bedding, putting on their night clothes. The fire would continue its slow work, unseen beneath the blanket of ash. The heat from the banked fire was not intense. It was a gentle, steady warmth. The backlog radiated heat into the cabin. The smouldering coals provided a low level of additional warmth. Together they maintained a temperature that, while far from comfortable by modern standards, was survivable. The air in the cabin would cool as the night progressed. The temperature might drop to just above freezing, or even below, depending on the severity of the outside cold and the quality of the cabin's chinking. But the fire, banked and smouldering, prevented the cabin from becoming as cold as the exterior air. The sound of the banked fire was distinctive. During the day, a fire crackled and popped as the wood burned. At night, the sound changed. There was an occasional quiet click, the sound of a coal shifting or a piece of the backlog settling. These sounds were faint, easily lost beneath the other noises of the night, the wind, the creaking of the logs, the rustle of bedding. But for those who lived with the fire, these sounds were reassuring. The click of the coals meant the fire was still alive. It meant that in the morning, the coals could be uncovered and the fire could be revived without having to start from scratch. The morning revival of the fire was the mirror image of the evening banking. The family would wake to a cold cabin. Their breath would be visible in the air, frost would have formed on the interior walls, condensed from the moisture of their breathing during the night. The first person awake, usually the father or the eldest son, would approach the fireplace. They would take the poker, a long iron rod, and carefully scrape back the ash. Beneath the ash, if the banking had been done correctly, the coals would still be glowing. They would be dim, barely visible in the morning gloom, but they would be alive. Fresh kindling would be placed on the coals. The kindling would catch, slowly at first, then with increasing vigour. Larger pieces of wood would be added, building the fire back up to a daytime burn. The cabin would begin to warm. The family would begin their day. This cycle, banking at night, reviving in the morning, was repeated every day throughout the winter. It was one of the fundamental rhythms of frontier life. The fire was never allowed to go out if it could be helped. Maintaining the fire was maintaining life. The backlog was not simply a large piece of wood. It was a carefully chosen component of the fire system, selected for specific properties that would maximize its effectiveness through the night. The selection process began in the forest or in the woodpile, depending on when the family had cut their winter supply. The log had to meet several criteria. It had to be large enough to last through the night without burning through completely. It had to be dense enough to burn slowly. And it had to be dry enough to burn cleanly without excessive smoke. Hickory met all these requirements better than any other commonly available wood. A hickory tree, when felled and split, produced logs that were heavy and hard. The wood had a tight grain, and it burned with an intense, steady heat. A hickory backlog, properly placed and banked, could smoulder for 8 to 10 hours, providing a continuous source of warmth. The preparation of the backlog began when the tree was cut. Hickory was not easy to split. The wood was dense and it resisted the wedge, but once split, it could be cut to the appropriate length. The backlog had to fit within the firebox, so its length was determined by the width of the fireplace. For a typical cabin fireplace, this meant a log between 2 and 3 feet long. The diameter of the backlog was equally important. A log that was too thin would burn through quickly. A log that was too thick might not burn at all, or it might only char on the surface without releasing significant heat. The ideal diameter was between 8 and 12 inches. This size provided enough mass to burn slowly while still allowing the fire to penetrate the wood and release its stored energy. Once cut to size, the backlog was left to dry. Green wood that had been recently cut and still contained a high percentage of moisture, did not burn well. It produced excessive smoke, and much of the fire's energy was wasted evaporating the water within the wood. Dry wood burned cleaner and hotter. The drying process took months. Wood cut in spring or summer would be ready for use by the following winter. The backlog was brought into the cabin and placed in a dry location, often near the hearth where it could continue to dry further. By the time it was needed, the wood would have lost most of its moisture content. The surface would have cracked slightly, a sign that the wood was ready. On a cold evening, as the family prepared to bank the fire, the backlog would be selected from the woodpile. It would be carried to the fireplace and positioned against the back wall of the firebox. The placement was deliberate. The log had to be stable, resting firmly so it would not roll forward during the night. It had to be close to the back wall, but not touching it directly, to allow air to circulate and prevent the wall from overheating. Once in position, the backlog would begin its work. The heat from the coals in front of it would start to affect the wood. The surface of the log facing the fire would begin to char. This charring was not rapid. It was a slow process, driven by the radiant heat from the coals rather than direct flame. As the surface charred, it would begin to release gases. These gases, primarily volatile organic compounds, would ignite when they came into contact with the hot coals. The result was a low, steady flame that licked along the front face of the log. This flame was not large or dramatic. It was a quiet, persistent burn that continued as long as the coals remained hot enough to ignite the gases. The backlog did not burn evenly. The front face, exposed to the heat, burned steadily. The sides and rear of the log remained, largely untouched. This uneven burning was intentional. It meant that the backlog did not consume itself completely in one night. A single log could be used for multiple nights, each time burning a bit deeper into its face. Eventually, after several nights of use, the backlog would burn through to the point where it was no longer effective. At that point, it would be replaced with a fresh log. The remnants of the old backlog, now reduced to a misshapen piece of charred wood, would be broken up and used as kindling or added to the daytime fire. The heat provided by the backlog was significant. The burning face of the log radiated warmth into the cabin. This radiant heat was more effective at warming the occupants than the convective heat from open flames. Radiant heat travelled in straight lines, warming objects and people directly. It did not rely on the movement of air, which meant it was less affected by drafts. The backlog also served as a buffer. It protected the back wall of the fireplace from the direct heat of the fire. Over time, even stone or brick could be damaged by repeated exposure to high temperatures. The backlog absorbed some of this heat, reducing the stress on the masonry. In the middle of the night, when the cabin was at its coldest, the backlog was the primary source of warmth. The coals, buried beneath their blanket of ash, provided a baseline of heat. But it was the backlog, glowing faintly in the darkness, that made the difference between a survivable night and a dangerous one. The family did not have to tend to the backlog. Once it was in place and the fire was banked, it required no further attention. It would do its work silently, steadily, through the long hours of darkness. In the morning, when the ash was scraped away and the fire was revived, the backlog would still be there, charred but intact, ready to provide warmth for another night. This reliability was part of why hickory was so valued. Other woods could be used, but they did not perform as well. Oak burned well, but not as long. Maple burned hot, but consumed itself more quickly. Pine and other softwoods were unsuitable for the backlog. They burned too fast and produced too much creosote, which could build up in the chimney and create a fire hazard. The knowledge of which woods to use and how to use them was passed down through generations. A father would teach his son how to select a good backlog, how to position it in the fireplace, how to judge when it needed to be replaced. This knowledge was practical, not theoretical. It was learned through doing, through the repetitive experience of managing a fire night after night, winter after winter. The backlog was a simple tool. It was just a piece of wood. But in the context of frontier survival, it was essential. It was the difference between waking to a warm cabin and waking to frost on the bedding. It was the difference between a fire that could be easily revived and a fire that had gone out completely, requiring a trip to the neighbour's cabin to borrow coals. The slow work of the backlog burning steadily through the night was emblematic of the broader approach to frontier survival. It was not dramatic, it was not exciting, it was patient, methodical, and reliable. And it worked. The bed was not a luxury, it was infrastructure. In a cabin where every object served a purpose tied to survival, the bed occupied a central place. It was where the family spent a third of each day. It was where body heat was conserved. It was where the line between manageable cold and dangerous cold was most clearly drawn. The construction of a bed began with the frame. The most common type was the rope bed, sometimes called a corded bed. The frame consisted of 4 posts, one at each corner, connected by rails. The posts were typically made from hardwood, maple, oak or ash, chosen for strength and durability. The rails were the critical component. They had to support the weight of the sleepers and the mattresses without sagging or breaking. Each rail was drilled with a series of holes spaced evenly along its length. These holes would receive the rope that formed the bed's support system. The rope used was usually hemp. Hemp rope was strong, resistant to rot, and held knots well. The rope was threaded through the holes in the rails, creating a grid pattern across the bed frame. The threading pattern varied, but the most common approach was to run the rope lengthwise first, then weave it crosswise, creating a lattice. The tension in the rope determined the bed's comfort and functionality. If the rope was too loose, the bed would sag in the middle, creating a depression where the sleeper would settle. This depression would trap cold air beneath the sleeper, reducing the effectiveness of the mattresses. If the rope was too tight, it would put excessive strain on the frame and might snap under weight. Achieving the right tension required a tool called a bed wrench or bed key. This was a wooden lever shaped to fit over the rails of the bed. The wrench was used to twist the rope, tightening it incrementally. The person doing the work would move around the bed systematically, tightening each section of rope until the entire surface was taut and even. The rope bed required regular maintenance. Over time, the hemp would stretch under the weight of the sleepers. The bed would begin to sag. When this happened, the family would take out the bed wrench and tighten the ropes again. This was a seasonal task, performed every few months, or whenever the sagging became noticeable. The phrase "sleep tight" likely originated from this practice. A bed with tight ropes provided better support and better insulation. A bed with loose ropes was uncomfortable and cold. The tightness of the ropes was directly connected to the quality of sleep. The height of the bed mattered. A bed that sat too close to the floor would be surrounded by the coldest air in the cabin. Cold air is denser than warm air, and it settles to the lowest points. A bed raised 12 to 18 inches off the floor allowed some of this cold air to pass beneath it, while the sleepers rested in slightly warmer air above. The bedposts themselves were often plain, without decoration. Ornamentation required time and skill that most frontier families did not have. The focus was on function. The posts had to be sturdy, the rails had to be strong, the rope had to hold. Everything else was secondary. Some families built beds directly into the corner of the cabin, using the walls as 2 sides of the frame. This saved materials and provided additional stability. These built-in beds were sometimes called bunk beds or wall beds. They were practical, though they offered no flexibility in placement. The rope bed was the foundation, but it was not where the sleepers rested directly. The ropes were too coarse, and the gaps between them too wide. What was needed was a layer of cushioning, a surface that would distribute weight and provide insulation from the cold air below. This is where the mattresses came in. But mattresses in the 1800s were not the unified objects we know today. They were layered systems, each layer serving a specific purpose in the hierarchy of warmth. The lowest layer resting directly on the ropes was the coarsest. This was often a tick filled with straw. Straw was abundant, especially in agricultural regions. After the grain harvest, the dried stalks were gathered and stored. When a mattress needed to be filled, the straw was brought into the cabin and stuffed into the tick. A tick was a large bag sewn from tightly woven fabric. The fabric had to be strong enough to contain the straw and tight enough to prevent the sharp ends from poking through. Ticking fabric, usually made from cotton or linen, was woven specifically for this purpose. Filling a straw tick was labour-intensive. The straw had to be clean and dry. It was stuffed into the tick handful by handful, packed firmly to create an even surface. The tick was filled until it was plump, then the opening was sewn shut. The result was a mattress that provided loft, the air gaps between the straw stalks, which served as insulation. But straw had significant drawbacks. It compressed under weight, losing its loft over the course of the night. It was noisy. Every movement caused the straw to rustle and crackle, and it did not last long. After a season of use, straw would break down into dust and fragments. The tick would need to be emptied, the old straw discarded and fresh straw packed in. Some families used corn husks instead of straw. Corn husks were even noisier than straw, producing a loud crunching sound with every movement. But they were readily available, and they provided similar insulation properties. The drawbacks were the same: compression, noise, and short lifespan. Above the straw or corn husk tick, if the family could afford it, came a second layer. This might be filled with wool or horsehair. Wool shorn from sheep was cleaned, carded, and packed into a tick. Wool provided better insulation than straw. It retained its loft longer, and it was quieter. But wool was a valuable commodity. It was needed for clothing, blankets, and trade. Not every family could spare enough wool for a mattress. Horsehair was an alternative. It was collected when horses were groomed or when they shed their winter coats. The hair was cleaned and twisted into loose ropes, which were then used to fill a tick. Horsehair was firm, almost springy. It did not compress as much as straw or wool, but it was scratchy, and it required a significant amount of hair to fill even a single mattress. These middle-layer mattresses provided a firmer, more stable sleeping surface. They reduced the amount of compression in the straw below and added an additional layer of insulation. But even with two mattresses, the bed was not yet complete. The top layer, the ultimate expression of warmth and comfort, was the feather bed. A feather bed was not a mattress in the modern sense. It was a thick quilted tick filled with down or feathers. It was placed on top of the other mattresses, creating a soft, enveloping surface that the sleepers could sink into. Feathers came from domestic geese or ducks. The birds were raised on the farm, and when they were slaughtered, their feathers were saved. But not all feathers were suitable for bedding. The best feathers were the soft, fluffy down from the breast and underside of the bird. These feathers had minimal structure, just a tuft of soft fibres that trapped air exceptionally well. Larger feathers, from the wings and tail, were less desirable. They had stiff central shafts called quills that could poke through the ticking and jab the sleeper. To make these feathers usable, the quills had to be removed. This was done by hand. Each feather was split, the quill was pulled out, and the remaining soft portion was curled over a sharp edge to fluff it. This preparation was tedious work, often done during the winter months when outdoor work was limited. Children and adults would sit by the fire preparing feathers one by one. A single feather bed required 35 to 50 pounds of prepared feathers. At a few feathers per bird, this represented the accumulated harvest of many birds over multiple years. Once enough feathers were prepared, they were stuffed into a tick. The tick for a feather bed was made from the finest, tightest weave fabric available. Even with tight weaving, small feathers could work their way through the fabric. The tick was sewn with small, close stitches to minimise this leakage. The filled feather bed was heavy and warm. It was placed on top of the other mattresses, and the sleepers would climb into bed and pull blankets over themselves. The feather bed would conform to their bodies, surrounding them with a layer of trapped air. This air, warmed by body heat, became the primary insulation against the cold night air. A feather bed was a major investment. It was often listed in wills, passed from one generation to the next. A well-made feather bed could last 50 years or more. It represented security, comfort, and a measure of prosperity. Not every family had one. For those who did, It was a prized possession, carefully maintained and protected. The bed, with its layers of straw, wool and feathers, was a thermal system. Each layer contributed to the overall insulation. The rope foundation kept the mattresses off the floor away from the coldest air. The straw tick provided bulk and initial loft. The wool or horsehair tick added firmness and stability. And the feather bed provided the final critical layer of warmth. But even the best bed was not enough on its own. The cabin was cold, the air was cold, and the human body, lying still through the long night, generated only a limited amount of heat. To survive, the bed had to be combined with other measures: heavy blankets, layers of clothing, and careful management of the fire. The bed was the foundation of sleep, but sleep required more than just a bed. The hierarchy of mattress fillers was not arbitrary. It reflected the realities of frontier economics and the properties of the materials themselves. Straw was at the bottom of the hierarchy because it was the most accessible. Every family that grew grain had straw. After the wheat or rye was harvested and threshed, the stalks remained. These stalks had limited use. They could be used for animal bedding, for thatching roofs, or for stuffing mattresses. They were essentially a byproduct, available in large quantities at little cost. The quality of straw mattered. Wheat straw was preferred over oat straw. Wheat straw was longer, stronger, and less likely to break down quickly. Rye straw was even better, though rye was less commonly grown in some regions. The straw had to be dry and free of mould. Damp straw would rot inside the tick, creating an unhealthy sleeping environment and a foul smell. The process of filling a straw tick was straightforward but required effort. The straw was brought into the cabin in bundles. The tick was laid out on the floor, its opening wide. Handfuls of straw were stuffed into the tick, distributed evenly to avoid lumps. The person doing the work would reach deep into the tick, pushing the straw into the corners and along the edges. Once the tick was full, it was plump and relatively firm. But this firmness was temporary. As soon as someone lay on the tick, the straw would compress. The hollow stalks would flatten, and the air gaps between them would shrink. By morning, the tick would have compressed significantly, and the sleeper would feel the ropes beneath. This compression was inevitable. It was why the straw tick was never used alone. It needed the layers above it to distribute weight and to provide additional insulation. But even with its limitations, the straw tick served its purpose. It kept the sleepers off the ropes, it provided some cushioning, and it trapped enough air to offer a basic level of insulation. The noise was a different matter. Straw ticks were loud. Every shift of position, every movement during sleep caused the straw to rustle. For modern sleepers, accustomed to silent mattresses, the noise would be disruptive. But for frontier families, it was simply part of the environment. The rustling of the straw was no more noteworthy than the crackling of the fire or the creaking of the cabin's timbers. Corn husks were similar to straw in function but different in character. They were the outer leaves of corn cobs, dried after the harvest. Corn husks were broader and flatter than straw, and they produced a different sound, a loud crunching rather than a soft rustling. A corn husk mattress was sometimes called a shuck tick. Corn husks had one advantage over straw. They were slightly more durable. They did not break down as quickly into dust, but they compressed just as much, and the noise they made was even more pronounced. A person rolling over on a shuck tick could wake the entire household. Some families experimented with other materials. Leaves, especially beech leaves, were used in some regions. Beech leaves, when dried, had a pleasant smell, faintly reminiscent of tea or tobacco. They were softer than straw and quieter than corn husks. A beech leaf mattress could last 7 to 8 years, which was longer than straw but shorter than wool. The disadvantage of leaves was their tendency to crumble. Over time, the leaves would break down into small fragments, and the tick would lose its loft. The fragments would settle to the bottom, creating an uneven surface. Eventually, the tick would need to be emptied and refilled. Wool represented a step up in the hierarchy. Wool had several properties that made it superior to plant-based fillers. It was resilient, meaning it could be compressed and would spring back to its original shape. It was a good insulator, trapping air between its fibres, and it had the ability to wick moisture away from the body, keeping the sleeper drier and warmer. But wool was not free. Sheep had to be raised, fed and protected. The wool had to be shorn, cleaned and processed. This required labour and time. For many frontier families, wool was too valuable to use in mattresses. It was needed for clothing, stockings, socks, undergarments, outer garments. Every pound of wool used in a mattress was a pound not available for the family's clothing needs. Families that had surplus wool or that had large flocks of sheep could afford to fill a mattress with it. The wool was carded to align the fibres and to remove debris. It was then packed into a tick, layer by layer, until the tick was full. A wool mattress was heavier than a straw mattress and significantly quieter. The wool mattress did not compress as much as straw. It maintained its loft better over time, but it still required occasional attention. The wool would shift inside the tick, creating lumps and thin spots. The tick would need to be opened, the wool redistributed, and the tick sewn shut again. Horsehair was another option for the middle layer. Horsehair was collected from horses' manes and tails. It was cleaned, sometimes boiled to remove oils and dirt, and then loosely twisted into bundles. These bundles were used to fill a tick. Horsehair was firm, almost springy. It provided excellent support and did not compress easily. A horsehair mattress could last for decades with minimal maintenance, but horsehair was scratchy. Even with a thick layer of fabric between the horsehair and the sleeper, the coarse texture could be felt, and horsehair was labour-intensive to collect and prepare. A single horse provided only a limited amount of hair, so filling a mattress required contributions from multiple animals over time. At the top of the hierarchy was the feather bed. Feathers, particularly down, were the best insulating material available to frontier families. Down is the soft, fluffy undercoating found beneath the outer feathers of waterfowl. It has a three-dimensional structure that traps air in countless tiny pockets. This trapped air is what provides insulation. The preparation of feathers was meticulous. Down could be used as is, but larger feathers required processing. The quill of each feather had to be removed to prevent it from poking through the ticking. This was done by hand, one feather at a time. The feather was split along the quill was pulled out, and the remaining soft part was fluffed and curled. This work was often done communally. Neighbours would gather for a feather stripping, where they would sit together, processing feathers while talking and sharing news. The social aspect made the tedious work more bearable. Over the course of an evening, a group could process several pounds of feathers. The feathers were stored until enough had been accumulated to fill a tick. The tick for a feather bed was sewn from the tightest weave fabric the family could obtain or make. Even so, small feathers and down would sometimes work their way through the fabric. A well-made feather bed was sewn with double seams and small tight stitches to minimise this leakage. Filling the feather bed was done carefully. The feathers were light and prone to scattering. The work was often done indoors, away from any breeze. The feathers were placed into the tick, handful by handful, distributed evenly. The person filling the tick would shake it periodically to settle the feathers and to ensure even distribution. Once filled, the feather bed was sewn shut. The finished product was thick, soft, and remarkably warm. A feather bed could weigh 40 to 50 pounds, depending on how densely it was filled. It was heavy to lift, but once placed on top of the other mattresses, it transformed the bed into a warm nest. The sleeper would lie down on the feather bed and sink into it, slightly. The feathers would compress under the body's weight, but unlike straw, they would not flatten completely. They would maintain their loft around the sleeper, creating an envelope of trapped air. This air, warmed by the body, provided the primary insulation. The feather bed required daily maintenance. Every morning it had to be plumped and smoothed. The feathers would shift during the night, creating uneven areas. By shaking and fluffing the feather bed, the family could redistribute the feathers and restore the even surface. This was part of the morning routine, done after the fire was revived and before the day's work began. A feather bed was an heirloom. It was cared for, protected, and passed down through generations. When a daughter married and left the household, she might take a feather bed with her as part of her dowry. When a son established his own cabin, he might receive a feather bed from his parents. The value of a feather bed was both practical and symbolic. It represented warmth, comfort, and the investment of years of labour. The layered mattress system, straw at the base, wool or horsehair in the middle, feathers on top, was the result of generations of experimentation. Each layer contributed to the whole. The straw provided bulk. The wool or horsehair provided support. The feathers provided warmth. Together they created a sleeping surface that, while far from modern standards of comfort, was adequate for survival in a cold cabin. But the mattresses were only part of the solution. The sleepers themselves had to be dressed for the cold. A single feather began its journey in the barnyard. Geese and ducks were common on frontier farms. They were raised for their meat, their eggs, and their feathers. The birds foraged for much of their food, reducing the burden on the family's grain stores. They were hardy, capable of surviving harsh conditions with minimal shelter. When a bird was slaughtered for meat, its feathers were not discarded. They were carefully plucked and saved. The soft down from the breast was separated from the larger feathers. The down was placed in a cloth sack and stored in a dry location. The larger feathers were set aside for processing. Feather plucking was not limited to slaughter. Some families practiced live plucking, removing feathers from geese during molting season. This was done carefully to avoid injuring the bird. The soft down could be harvested without harming the goose, and the bird would regrow its feathers. This allowed a single flock to contribute feathers year after year. The feathers, once collected, had to be cleaned. Fresh feathers contained oils, dirt, and sometimes parasites. They were washed in hot water, sometimes with soap or lye, to remove contaminants. The washing also removed the natural oils that made the feathers water-resistant. For bedding, this was acceptable. The feathers did not need to repel water once they were inside a tick. After washing, the feathers were dried. This was done by spreading them in a thin layer on a clean surface, often on a sheet laid out in the sun. The feathers had to be turned periodically to ensure even drying. If they remained damp, they would develop mould, which would make them unusable. Once dry, the feathers were ready for processing. The down required no further work. It was already in the ideal form for bedding. But the larger feathers, the contour feathers from the body, and the flight feathers from the wings, required attention. Each of these feathers had a central shaft, the quill. The quill was stiff and hard. If left in place, it would poke through the ticking and jab the sleeper. The quill had to be removed. The process was called stripping. The person doing the work would hold the feather in one hand and run their thumb and forefinger down the quill, splitting the soft barbs away from the shaft. Once the barbs were separated, the quill could be pulled out. What remained was a small tuft of soft material, similar in structure to down. This tuft was then curled. Curling was done by running the edge of the tuft across a sharp surface, the back of a knife blade, the edge of a table, or a specialized curling tool. The motion caused the barbs to separate and fluff, increasing the tuft's volume and its ability to trap air. A single feather might yield only a small amount of usable material after stripping and curling. To fill a feather bed required processing thousands of feathers. This was why feather beds were accumulated over years. A family might slaughter a few geese each autumn. The feathers from those birds would be added to the collection. After several years, there would be enough to fill a tick. The work of stripping feathers was often done during the winter, when outdoor work was limited. It was a task that could be done while sitting by the fire. Family members would gather in the evening, each with a pile of feathers, and work steadily through them. Children learned to strip feathers as soon as their hands were nimble enough to handle the delicate work. The social aspect of the work was significant. Feather stripping was often done communally, with neighbours gathering at one cabin or another. While they worked, they talked, shared stories and exchanged news. The work was tedious, but the company made it tolerable. And at the end of the evening, each family would take home a portion of the processed feathers, contributing to their own accumulation. Once enough feathers had been collected and processed, the tick could be filled. The tick was made from tightly woven linen or cotton. The weave had to be tight enough to contain the down and the stripped feathers. Even the best fabric was not perfect. Small bits of down would sometimes work their way through the weave, creating a faint dusting of feathers around the bed. The tick was sewn with strong thread, using small, tight stitches. The seams were often double-stitched to reduce the likelihood of feathers escaping. One end of the tick was left open for filling. The filling process required care. Feathers and down were light and easily scattered. The work was done indoors, away from drafts. The person filling the tick would take handfuls of feathers and place them into the opening, pushing them deep into the tick to distribute them evenly. The tick was filled in stages. After adding a certain amount of feathers, the person would shake the tick to settle the contents and check for uneven areas. More feathers would be added, focusing on thin spots. This process continued until the tick was uniformly full. The amount of feathers used determined the thickness and warmth of the feather bed. A lightly filled tick would be thinner and less warm but easier to manage. A densely filled tick would be thick and very warm but also heavy. The family would decide based on their needs and the severity of their winters. Once the tick was filled to satisfaction, the opening was sewn shut. The stitching had to be secure. A poorly sewn opening would allow feathers to escape over time. The finished feather bed was then carried to the sleeping area and placed on top of the other mattresses. The feather bed transformed the sleeping experience. Instead of lying on a relatively firm surface, the sleeper would sink slightly into the feathers. The feathers would compress under the body's weight but would maintain their loft around the sides and over the top. This created a cocoon effect, surrounding the sleeper with warmth, but the feather bed required daily attention. Every morning after the sleepers rose, the feather bed had to be fluffed. The feathers would have shifted during the night, creating lumps in some areas and thin spots in others. By lifting the corners of the tick and shaking it vigorously, the family could redistribute the feathers and restore the bed's even surface. This fluffing was not optional. If the feather bed was not maintained, the feathers would compact in certain areas, reducing the insulation in those spots. Over time, the bed would become uneven and less effective at retaining warmth. The daily ritual of fluffing ensured that the feather bed continued to perform as intended. The feather bed also had to be protected. During the day, when the bed was not in use, it was often covered with a clean sheet or blanket to keep dust and dirt from settling on it. This covering was removed at night, before the family went to bed. Periodically, perhaps once a year, the feather bed would be taken outside and aired. It would be hung on a line or draped over a fence, exposed to sunlight and fresh air. This airing helped to remove any moisture that had accumulated in the feathers and to kill any insects that might have taken up residence. After a few hours in the sun, the feather bed would be brought back inside, ready for another year of use. The longevity of a feather bed was remarkable. With proper care, a feather bed could last 50 years or more. The feathers themselves did not degrade quickly. They retained their structure and their insulating properties for decades. The tick might wear out before the feathers did. When this happened, the tick would be replaced and the feathers would be transferred to the new tick. A feather bed was often one of the most valuable items in a household. In estate inventories from the period, feather beds were listed alongside land, livestock and tools. They were bequeathed in wills, passed from parents to children. A family that owned a feather bed was considered to have achieved a measure of comfort and security. But not every family had a feather bed. For those who did not, the winter nights were colder. They made do with straw and wool, with extra blankets, with sleeping close together. They survived. But the feather bed represented something more than survival. It represented the culmination of years of effort, the slow accumulation of a resource that could not be rushed or bought easily. It was warmth earned through patience and labour. The journey of a single feather, from the goose's breast to the feather bed, was emblematic of the broader pattern of frontier life. Nothing was wasted, everything was used, and comfort when it came slowly, built up over time through small, steady efforts. The clothing worn to bed was as important as the bed itself. In a cabin where the interior temperature could drop to near freezing, even with a banked fire, exposed skin was a liability. Body heat would radiate away into the cold air. The extremities, hands, feet, head, were particularly vulnerable. These areas had the greatest surface area relative to their volume, and they lost heat rapidly. The solution was to cover as much of the body as possible. Frontier families did not sleep in the minimal clothing that later generations would adopt. They slept fully dressed, in layers of fabric designed to trap air and hold warmth close to the skin. The primary fabric for winter night clothing was linsey woolsey. This was a hybrid textile woven with a linen warp and a woolen weft. The combination utilised the strengths of both fibres. Linen made from flax was strong and durable. It absorbed moisture well, which helped wick sweat away from the skin. Wool provided insulation. Its crimped fibres trapped air, creating a layer of warmth. Linsey woolsey was not soft. The weave was coarse, and the fabric had a rough texture. It was scratchy against the skin, especially for those not accustomed to it, but it was effective. And for frontier families, effectiveness took precedence over comfort. The production of linsey woolsey began with the cultivation of flax. Flax was grown in small plots, often near the cabin. The plants were harvested when they reached maturity, pulled from the ground rather than cut. The stalks were then retted, a process of soaking them in water to break down the outer layer and expose the fibres within. After retting, the flax was dried and then broken using a wooden tool called a flax break. This shattered the woody core of the stalk, leaving the long fibres intact. These fibres were then hackled, combed through a bed of sharp metal teeth to remove debris and align the strands. The result was a handful of clean, smooth linen fibres, ready for spinning. Spinning was done on a spinning wheel, a tool that every household either owned or had access to. The spinner would draw out the flax fibres, twisting them into a continuous thread. This thread was wound onto a spindle, creating a spool of linen yarn. Wool followed a different process. Sheep were shorn in late spring or early summer, when their winter coats were thickest. The fleece was washed to remove dirt and lanolin, then dried. Once dry, the wool was carded, brushed with a pair of paddle-like tools covered in small wire teeth. Carding aligned the fibres and removed tangles, preparing the wool for spinning. The wool was spun in the same manner as flax, though the resulting yarn was thicker and softer. The wool yarn was wound onto spools ready for weaving. Weaving linsey woolsey required a loom. The loom was set up with the linen warp threads, stretched tightly from front to back. The wool weft was then woven through the warp over and under, creating the fabric. The weaving process was slow and required attention to maintain even tension and spacing. Once woven, the linsey woolsey fabric was washed and sometimes fulled, a process of pounding or agitating it to tighten the weave. The finished fabric was durable, warm, and ready to be cut and sewn into garments. For nightwear, the most common garment was the nightshirt. Men wore long nightshirts that reached to the knees or below. These were made from linsey woolsey or, if available, flannel. Flannel was softer than linsey woolsey, made from loosely woven wool that had been brushed to raise a nap. Flannel was warmer and more comfortable, but it was also more expensive and less durable. The nightshirt had long sleeves that extended to the wrists. The collar was high, covering the neck. Every opening, every gap in the fabric was a place where heat could escape. The design of the nightshirt minimized these gaps. Women wore similar garments, though the terminology differed. A woman's nightwear might be called a chemise or a shift. It was a long, loose garment, similar in construction to the men's nightshirt, but often extending to the ankles. Over the chemise, a woman might wear a bedgown, a lightweight jacket that provided an additional layer of warmth over the upper body. During the day, women wore petticoats under their dresses. At night, some women kept their petticoats on, adding another layer of insulation. The petticoat was made from wool or linsey woolsey, designed to trap air and retain warmth. Children were dressed similarly to adults, though their garments were smaller. Babies and very young children were bundled in layers of fabric, sometimes wrapped in blankets or shawls in addition to their clothing. The goal was to keep their small bodies from losing heat too rapidly. Stockings were essential. Feet, being at the extremity of the body, were prone to cold. Wool stockings, knitted by hand, covered the feet and extended up the calves or even to the knees. The stockings were thick, with a dense knit that provided insulation. Knitting stockings was a common winter activity. Women and older girls would knit while sitting by the fire, producing stockings for the entire family. A single pair of stockings might take several days to complete, depending on the knitter's skill and the complexity of the pattern. The stockings were worn to bed, along with the rest of the night clothing. In the coldest weather, some families wore 2 pairs of stockings, one over the other, to provide additional warmth. The nightcap was perhaps the most critical garment. The human head loses a significant amount of heat relative to its size. Blood vessels near the surface of the scalp radiate warmth into the surrounding air. Without covering, the head becomes a major source of heat loss. The nightcap was designed to prevent this. It was a close-fitting cap made from flannel or wool that covered the head completely. Some nightcaps had ear flaps that could be tied under the chin, providing additional protection. Others were simple, rounded caps that fit snugly over the crown of the head. The nightcap was worn by both men and women, and by children as well. It was not considered unusual or uncomfortable, it was simply necessary. Without it, the sleeper would wake with cold ears and a cold head, no matter how many blankets they had piled on top of themselves. In addition to the nightcap, some families used bed curtains. These were heavy fabric panels hung from a frame around the bed. When the curtains were drawn closed, they enclosed the bed, creating a small tent-like space. This space could be warmed by body heat alone, without relying on the fire. Bed curtains were common in wealthier households, and in regions with particularly severe winters, they required a 4-poster bed with tall posts that could support the curtain frame. The curtains themselves were made from heavy wool or a thick cotton weave. They blocked drafts and trapped warmth, creating a microclimate within the larger cold cabin. But bed curtains were not universal. Many frontier families did not have 4-poster beds, and the fabric required for full-length curtains was expensive. Those without curtains relied more heavily on blankets and on the communal warmth of sleeping close together. Blankets were layered on top of the sleepers. The blankets were made from wool, woven or knitted into large, thick sheets. A single blanket might weigh 5 or 10 pounds. Multiple blankets were used, piled one on top of another, creating a heavy, insulating layer. The weight of the blankets helped to trap air between the layers. Air is a poor conductor of heat, which makes it an excellent insulator. The more air that could be trapped, the warmer the sleeper would be. The blankets, in combination with the feather bed below and the clothing on the sleeper's body, created a multi-layered thermal system. This system was not perfectly efficient. Heat still escaped, particularly from the edges of the bed where the blankets did not seal tightly. Cold air still seeped in through gaps in the cabin's chinking. The fire still required tending to maintain even a minimal level of warmth in the room. But the system worked. It worked well enough that families survived night after night through months of brutal cold. The clothing, the bedding, the fire, all of it together created a balance, a point where the heat generated by the body and the fire was sufficient to offset the cold of the winter night. The fabric of night, then, was not just the cloth itself, but the entire woven system of materials and practices that made sleep possible. Each thread, each stitch, each layer contributed to the whole, and the whole, imperfect as it was, allowed the pioneers to rest. The nightcap was a simple object, but its importance was disproportionate to its size. It was typically made from a single piece of fabric, cut and sewn into a shape that would fit snugly over the head. The fabric was flannel, if it could be afforded, or linsey woolsey if flannel was not available. Some nightcaps were knitted from wool, using the same techniques employed for stockings. Knitted nightcaps had the advantage of being stretchy, conforming to the shape of the head more easily than woven fabric. The construction was straightforward. A woven nightcap might be made from 2 pieces of fabric sewn together in a rounded shape, with a band at the bottom to fit around the circumference of the head. A knitted nightcap was worked in the round, starting at the band and increasing stitches to create the crown. Either way, the result was a cap that covered the top and sides of the head, leaving only the face exposed. Some nightcaps had additional features. Ear flaps, sewn onto the sides, could be pulled down to cover the ears. Ties attached to the ear flaps could be fastened under the chin to keep the cap in place during sleep. These features were more common in regions with the coldest winters, where even a small amount of exposed skin could lead to frostbite. The nightcap was worn by everyone in the household, regardless of age or gender. Men, women and children all wore nightcaps to bed. In an era where many social conventions governed dress and appearance, the nightcap was one of the few garments that was truly universal. The reason for this universality was physiological. The human body regulates its temperature through several mechanisms, one of which is the dilation and constriction of blood vessels near the skin's surface. When the body's cold, it constricts blood vessels in the extremities to preserve warmth in the core, but the head is different. The blood vessels in the scalp remain dilated to ensure a steady supply of oxygen to the brain. This means that the head loses heat continuously, regardless of the ambient temperature. In a cold environment, this heat loss can be significant. Studies conducted in later years would quantify this. The head accounts for approximately 7 to 10% of the body's total surface area, but can account for up to 40% of heat loss in cold conditions depending on clothing. Frontier families did not have access to these studies, but they understood the principle through experience. They knew that sleeping without a nightcap resulted in cold ears, a cold head, and a generally uncomfortable night. They knew that a person who removed their nightcap during the night would wake feeling colder, even if all other conditions remained the same. The nightcap, then, was not a matter of fashion or tradition. It was a matter of thermal efficiency. By covering the head, the nightcap prevented a significant amount of heat loss. This heat retained within the body contributed to overall warmth and reduced the energy required to maintain body temperature through the night. The care of the nightcap was minimal. It was worn every night, and over time it would absorb oils from the hair and scalp. Periodically it would be washed, usually at the same time as other linens. The nightcap would be rinsed in water, sometimes with soap, then wrung out and hung to dry. Once dry, it was ready for use again. Most individuals owned only 1 or 2 nightcaps. They were simple to make, requiring only a small amount of fabric and a short amount of sewing time. A worn nightcap would be repaired if possible, or replaced if it was beyond repair. The fabric from an old nightcap might be repurposed into patches for other garments, or into rags for cleaning. The nightcap was part of the nightly routine. As the family prepared for bed, each person would put on their nightcap along with the rest of their night clothing. The cap would be adjusted to fit snugly, pulled down over the ears if it had ear flaps, tied under the chin if it had ties. In the morning, the nightcap would be removed and set aside, ready for the next night. Some families hung their nightcaps on pegs near the bed. Others folded them and placed them under the pillow or mattress. The specific practice varied, but the nightcap was always kept close at hand, ready for use. The nightcap also had a psychological dimension. Putting on the nightcap was a signal that the day was ending and sleep was beginning. It was part of the transition from waking life to rest. In a world where daily routines were governed by the sun and the seasons, these small rituals helped to structure time and create a sense of order. For children, the nightcap was a comfort. It was familiar, a piece of the nightly routine that remained constant. In a cabin that was cold and dark, where the wind rattled the door and the fire cast, flickering shadows, the nightcap was a small, tangible source of warmth. For adults, the nightcap was a necessity. It was one more element in the system of survival, one more way to conserve heat and make it through the night. It was not dramatic or noteworthy. It was simply part of what had to be done. The nightcap's necessity extended beyond the bedroom. In some households, nightcaps were worn throughout the day during the coldest part of winter. A person working inside the cabin, engaged in tasks that did not generate much body heat, might keep their nightcap on to stay warm. The distinction between daycap and nightcap blurred in the depths of winter, when warmth took precedence over convention. In the end, the nightcap was emblematic of the frontier approach to winter survival. It was simple, practical, and effective. It required no advanced technology, no expensive materials. It was something that every family could make and use, and it worked. The nightcap kept the head warm, and a warm head made the difference between a tolerable night and a miserable one. The fire's warmth did not extend far into the cabin. Even with a well-built fireplace and a properly banked fire, the heat dissipated rapidly as it moved away from the hearth. The air near the fireplace might be comfortably warm, but a few feet away the temperature would drop significantly. And the bed, positioned against the wall or in a corner to maximise space, was often the coldest spot in the cabin. This distance between the fire and the bed created a problem. The family needed to be warm when they climbed into bed. The mattresses, even with their layers of straw, wool and feathers, started the night cold. The blankets were cold. The air trapped between the layers was cold. Without some way to pre-warm the bed, the sleepers would spend the first hours of the night shivering, waiting for their body heat to gradually warm the space around them. The solution was to transfer heat from the fire to the bed before sleeping. This was done using tools specifically designed for heat transfer: warming pans, heated stones, and heated bricks. The warming pan was the most sophisticated of these tools. It consisted of a shallow metal pan with a hinged lid and a long wooden handle. The pan was typically made of copper or brass, metals that conducted heat well. The lid had perforations, small holes that allowed air to circulate while containing the heat source inside. To use the warming pan, it was filled with hot coals from the fireplace. These were not flaming coals but glowing embers, the same type used for banking the fire. The lid was closed and latched, and the pan was carried by its long handle to the bed. The person using the warming pan would slide it between the layers of mattresses or between the sheets, moving it back and forth in a slow, sweeping motion. The heat from the coals would radiate through the metal pan, warming the fabric and the air trapped within the bedding. The process took several minutes. The pan would be moved across the entire surface of the bed, ensuring that all areas received some warmth. Once the bed was warmed, the warming pan was removed, and the coals were returned to the fireplace. The bed would retain the transferred heat for a short time, long enough for the sleepers to climb in and begin generating their own body heat. The warming pan was effective, but it was not common on the frontier. Copper and brass were expensive materials. A warming pan required the services of a metalsmith, and smiths were not always available in newly settled areas. Families that owned warming pans had often brought them from the east, or purchased them in established towns. For most frontier families, warming pans were a luxury they could not afford. The more common alternative was the heated stone. Stones were abundant, free, and required no specialised tools to use. The process was simple: a smooth, flat stone, often a piece of soapstone, sandstone, or river rock, was placed in the fire in the late afternoon or early evening. The stone would be positioned near the coals, but not directly in the flames, where it might crack from the intense heat. Over the course of several hours, the stone would absorb heat. By bedtime, it would be extremely hot, capable of retaining warmth for many hours. The stone was removed from the fire using tongs or wrapped in a thick cloth to protect the hands. It was then wrapped in additional layers of cloth or placed in a cloth bag to prevent it from burning the bedding or the sleeper. The wrapped stone was placed at the foot of the bed, where the feet would rest. Feet were particularly vulnerable to cold. They were far from the body's core, and blood flow to the feet decreased in cold conditions. Cold feet were not just uncomfortable, they made it difficult to fall asleep and stay asleep. The heated stone provided localized warmth. It radiated heat through the layers of fabric, warming the feet and the surrounding bedding. The stone would remain warm for several hours, long enough for the sleeper to fall asleep and for body heat to begin warming the rest of the bed. Soapstone was particularly valued for this purpose. Soapstone has a high heat capacity, meaning it can absorb and store a large amount of thermal energy. It also releases heat slowly and evenly, providing a steady source of warmth. A soapstone block 6 inches square and an inch thick could remain warm through most of the night. Not all families had access to soapstone. The stone was found in specific geological formations and was not universally available. Families without soapstone used whatever stones were at hand. River rocks worked reasonably well, though they had a lower heat capacity than soapstone. Flat pieces of sandstone or limestone were also used. The stone had to be chosen carefully. Not all rocks were suitable for heating. Some types of stone, particularly those with high moisture content, could crack or explode when heated. Shale and certain types of sedimentary rock were dangerous. The safest stones were those that had been tested repeatedly and proven to withstand the thermal stress. An alternative to stones was bricks, in areas where clay was available and where families had the knowledge to make bricks. Heated bricks served the same purpose as stones. Bricks were uniform in size and shape, which made them easier to wrap and position in the bed. They also had good heat retention properties, though not quite as good as soapstone. The bricks were heated in the same manner as stones placed near the fire for several hours. Once hot, they were wrapped and placed in the bed. Some families used multiple bricks, placing one at the foot of the bed and another near the middle, to provide warmth along a greater length of the sleeping area. The wrapping of the stone or brick was important. The cloth had to be thick enough to prevent burns, but not so thick that it insulated the stone completely and prevented heat transfer. Old rags, worn-out garments, or pieces of blanket were commonly used. The fabric would char slightly over time from repeated use, developing dark spots where it had been in contact with the hot stone. There were hazards associated with heated stones and bricks. If the wrapping was insufficient, the stone could burn through the bedding or cause burns on the sleeper's skin. If the stone was placed directly against the skin, even through stockings, it could cause serious burns. Children had to be taught to be cautious around the heated stones to avoid touching them directly. Another method of transferring heat was the foot warmer. This was a wooden box, usually made from thin boards, with a metal container inside. The metal container held hot coals, and the wooden box protected the surroundings from direct contact with the heat. The box had a wire handle for carrying, and often had decorative piercing on the sides to allow heat to radiate out. Foot warmers were used both for sleeping and for sitting. During the day, a person working at a task that required sitting still, sewing for example, might place a foot warmer under their skirt or blanket to keep their feet warm. At night, the foot warmer could be placed in the bed, though it was less common for sleeping than the simpler heated stone. The use of these heat transfer tools was part of the evening routine. As the family finished their evening meal and prepared for bed, someone would place the stones or bricks in the fire. If a warming pan was available, coals would be prepared for it. The timing had to be right. The stones needed several hours to heat fully, so they had to be placed in the fire early enough, but they could not be left too long, or they might become too hot to handle safely. While the stones heated, the rest of the bedtime preparations continued. The fire would be banked, the bed would be checked, the rope tension verified, the mattresses smoothed. The nightclothes would be put on layer by layer, and finally, when everything was ready, the heated stones would be retrieved from the fire, wrapped and placed in the bed. The family would climb into bed quickly, minimizing the time the blankets were open, and the time cold air could enter the warm space they had created. The stones would radiate their warmth, the body heat of multiple sleepers would begin to accumulate, and gradually the bed would become a warm refuge in the cold cabin. The heat borrowed from the fire was temporary. The stones would cool over the course of the night. By morning, they would be only slightly warmer than the ambient air, but by then, the sleeper's body heat had taken over, warming the space beneath the blankets. The stones had served their purpose, bridging the gap between the cold bed and the warm rest. This transfer of heat, from fire to stone to bed, was another example of the systematic approach to survival. Each step was simple, each tool was basic, but together they created a solution to the problem of sleeping in extreme cold. The frontier family did not expect comfort. They worked to create the minimum conditions for rest, and with patience and routine they succeeded. Privacy was a luxury the frontier cabin could not accommodate. The typical one-room cabin measured between 12 and 18 feet on each side. Within this space lived the entire family, parents, children, and sometimes elderly relatives or visitors. There were no separate bedrooms, no walls to divide the space. Everything happened in a single room, cooking, eating, working, and sleeping. This lack of space dictated sleeping arrangements. The bed, the largest and most important piece of furniture, occupied a significant portion of the cabin. But even a large bed could not hold an entire family comfortably. The solution was to sleep close together, using body heat as a shared resource. The primary bed was usually reserved for the parents and the youngest, children. Infants slept between the parents or on the mother's side of the bed, where they could be nursed during the night without disturbing the rest of the household. Toddlers slept at the foot of the bed, or nestled between the adults. Older children had their own sleeping arrangements. If the family owned a trundle bed, this would be pulled out from beneath the main bed at night. The trundle was a low bed frame on wheels or wooden runners. During the day, it was stored under the main bed, out of the way. At night it was hauled out and positioned near the fireplace where the floor was warmest. The trundle bed was equipped with the same rope support system as the main bed, though on a smaller scale. It held 1 or 2 mattresses depending on the family's resources. 2 or 3 children might sleep on a single trundle bed, sharing the warmth and the space. If there was no trundle bed, children slept on pallets. A pallet was simply a mattress or a folded blanket laid directly on the floor. The pallets were positioned in front of the fireplace, where the hearthstones radiated residual heat from the day's fire. This was the warmest spot on the floor, and it was reserved for the children. Sleeping on the floor had disadvantages. The floorboards, even when covered with a mattress, were hard. Cold air seeped up through the gaps between the boards, but the proximity to the fireplace compensated for these drawbacks. The children, bundled in their nightclothes and covered with blankets, slept soundly on their pallets. The number of people in a bed was not fixed. It varied depending on the size of the family, the severity of the weather, and the presence of guests. On the coldest nights, the family might crowd together more than usual, prioritising warmth over comfort. An extra child might be added to the main bed, or 2 pallets might be pushed together to allow more children to share body heat. This crowding was not seen as a hardship, it was understood as necessary. The children accepted it as normal. They had never known anything different. The warmth provided by sleeping close to siblings or parents was tangible and immediate. It made the night bearable. Body heat is a significant source of warmth. An adult human generates approximately 100 watts of heat at rest, roughly equivalent to a small incandescent light bulb. This heat is produced by metabolic processes, the body burning calories to maintain its functions. In a cold environment, the body works harder to maintain its core temperature, generating even more heat. When multiple people sleep close together, their combined body heat accumulates in the space beneath the blankets. The air trapped in this space warms more quickly and stays warmer longer than it would for a single sleeper. The effect is multiplicative. 2 people sleeping together are warmer than twice as warm as 1 person sleeping alone. Frontier families understood this principle through experience. They did not know the physics of thermodynamics, but they knew that sleeping together was warmer. This knowledge informed their sleeping arrangements. Children were paired or grouped. The bed was shared. No one slept alone if it could be avoided. The practice extended beyond the immediate family. Hospitality was a strong social norm on the frontier. Travellers, neighbours in need, or visiting relatives were welcomed into the home, even when space was limited. The guest would be offered a place to sleep, which often meant sharing a bed with the family. There are accounts from the period of beds holding 4, 5, or even 6 people. The arrangements were practical rather than comfortable. The sleepers would lie side by side, often crosswise on the bed to make better use of the space. Blankets would be layered over everyone, creating a shared pool of warmth. In some cases, guests were asked to remove their boots or spurs before climbing into bed. This request, recorded in diaries and letters, was both practical and humorous. Boots took up space and could damage the bedding. Spurs, worn by riders, posed an obvious hazard to anyone sharing the bed. The lack of privacy extended to all aspects of life in the one-room cabin. Bathing, dressing, and using the chamber pot all occurred in the same space where the family slept and ate. Modesty was maintained through timing and discretion, rather than physical separation. Individuals would turn their backs or step outside briefly when privacy was needed. But at night, in the darkness, these concerns faded. The cabin was lit only by the faint glow of the banked fire. Faces were indistinct. Movements were muted. The focus was on warmth and rest, not on maintaining social boundaries. The communal sleeping arrangements created a particular social dynamic. The family members were constantly aware of each other. They heard each other